The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting soft rays across the kitchen table. John sat with a cup of coffee, scrolling through his emails before heading to work. Emily, his wife of 6 years, was bustling around the kitchen, packing her bag and preparing her breakfast. It was a normal morning for the couple, both employed at the same tech company, though they rarely interacted at work since they were in different departments. John worked as a software engineer, while Emily was in human resources. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed loudly on the counter, lighting up with a notification. John's eyes flicked over absent-mindedly as she quickly grabbed it, tilting the screen away from him. She seemed unusually flustered. For a split second, he caught a glimpse of the sender's name, Thomas. "Who's that?" John asked, his tone casual but with an edge of curiosity. "Oh, just work stuff," Emily replied, her voice too quick, too rehearsed. She smiled briefly but didn't meet his eyes as she tucked her phone into her pocket and hurriedly took a sip of coffee. "We have a big HR meeting coming up, and Mr. Thomas has been asking a lot of questions lately. He's trying to make sure everything is in place." John nodded slowly, but something about her demeanor didn't sit right. Mr. Thomas, their boss, was a much older man, a senior executive who'd been with the company for decades. He was the kind of boss you had to impress if you wanted to climb the corporate ladder, but John had never seen Emily this flustered over a simple work email before. As they finished breakfast, Emily glanced at the clock. "I'll head out early today. I need to be there before the rest of the team shows up," she said, grabbing her keys and giving John a quick kiss on the cheek. John watched her leave, feeling a small knot of unease tightening in his chest. He shook it off, chalking it up to his own stress about an upcoming project at work. It was probably nothing. Emily had always been ambitious, and lately, she had been talking about aiming for a promotion. Maybe that was it. She was just working extra hard to get noticed by upper management. But as he got ready for work, John's mind kept circling back to the moment she had grabbed her phone so quickly. Why had she been so nervous? Later that morning, John sat in his office, unable to focus on his coding. Every time he tried to clear his head, the image of Thomas on Emily's phone screen nagged at him. Was there something going on that he didn't know about? He remembered Emily mentioning that Mr. Thomas had been offering mentorship to certain employees, particularly those seeking promotions. Maybe it was nothing more than that. But there was something about her behavior that day, and the past few weeks, if he was being honest, that didn't feel right. She had been more distant, spending late hours at the office, always with the excuse of having to stay on top of things. He trusted Emily, or at least he had, but the unease was building. That afternoon, John passed by Mr. Thomas's office while heading to a meeting. The door was slightly ajar, and as he glanced inside, he saw Emily sitting across from their boss, her body language relaxed, almost too casual. They were laughing about something, but the sight made John's stomach twist. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was he being paranoid, or was there something more going on between his wife and their much older boss? The following weeks brought a subtle shift in Emily's behavior that John couldn't ignore. At first, it was little things. She started dressing a bit more formally for work, putting more effort into her appearance. She would leave earlier than usual, claiming she had to prepare for meetings with Mr. Thomas. The changes were subtle, but each one planted a deeper seed of doubt in John's mind. One Friday night, after a long week of work, John suggested they grab dinner together at their favorite restaurant. Emily, however, was hesitant. "I can't tonight," she said, tapping away on her phone. "Mr. Thomas has asked me to stay late again to help with some paperwork for an upcoming project." John nodded, trying not to let his disappointment show. "Another late night with him?" She gave him a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just trying to make a good impression. It's important, you know? Especially if I want that promotion." John said nothing more, but as she gathered her things to head back to the office, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest. Emily had been staying late almost every other night now. She often arrived home after John had gone to bed, offering vague explanations about being swamped with work. But something about this sudden surge in her professional duties didn't add up. After Emily left, John sat at the kitchen table, his thoughts swirling. He decided to pour himself a drink, hoping to drown out the nagging voice of doubt. As he poured the whiskey, His eyes fell on Emily's phone, which she had left behind in her hurry. It was unlike her to leave without it. He picked it up, tempted to scroll through her messages, but hesitated. He had never invaded her privacy like this before, and he hated the idea of becoming suspicious without solid reason. But the growing distance between them, the late nights, the phone calls she took in the other room, none of it felt right. He unlocked the phone, feeling a knot of guilt in his stomach. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Emails from work, notifications from apps, and messages from friends. But then he found something that sent a chill through him. A series of text messages between Emily and Mr. Thomas. The exchanges were cryptic, but the tone was far too familiar for his liking. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I'll be ready," one of her messages read. His heart pounded in his chest. What did she mean, ready? Another text from Mr. Thomas said, "Looking forward to our time together. You've really outdone yourself lately." John's hand trembled as he scrolled through the messages, searching for any explanation that would make sense. But the more he read, the worse it got. Their exchanges were peppered with vague references to late nights and private meetings. Nothing overtly explicit, but enough to make John's stomach turn. He set the phone down, heart racing. His mind was now a battlefield, torn between wanting to confront Emily immediately and waiting for more concrete evidence. He decided to wait, to see just how deep this betrayal ran. The next few days, John's suspicion only grew. Emily became more distant, always on her phone, always running off to some urgent meeting or last-minute project with Mr. Thomas. She stopped asking him how his day was, or even bothering with small talk at dinner. Her excuses for the late nights became repetitive, and John started to doubt everything she said. One evening, after Emily had left for another late meeting, John's patience wore thin. He decided to check her laptop, something he had never done before. Emily often worked from home on weekends, so her work laptop was always out in the living room. He knew it was a long shot, but desperation was driving him now. He wasn't tech-savvy enough to hack into her email, but one thing stood out immediately, a file marked Performance Review, Confidential. John opened it, expecting to find work-related content. Instead, he found notes from Mr. Thomas, praising Emily for her extraordinary commitment and dedication. But the language was far too personal. Mr. Thomas had written about Emily in a way that went beyond professional admiration. He mentioned how much he enjoyed their time together and how her contributions had been essential to his own success. John sat back, numb. The pieces were starting to fall into place. This wasn't just a work relationship. Emily and Mr. Thomas were closer than she had ever admitted. But how close were they? That night, when Emily came home, she acted like nothing had changed. She smiled, kissed John on the cheek, and told him she was tired. "I'm going to shower and head to bed," she said, disappearing into the bathroom. John watched her go, feeling the weight of the secrets piling up. He knew now that something more than just work was going on between Emily and Mr. Thomas, but he still didn't have undeniable proof. For now, he'd keep watching, waiting, hoping he was wrong, but knowing in his gut that he wasn't. The quiet storm of suspicion had turned into a hurricane, and John knew there was no turning back. The uneasy tension in John's mind had reached a boiling point. Each day felt like another step toward confirming the thing he dreaded most. But now, he needed answers. Concrete proof that would either dispel his fears or confirm his worst suspicions. He could no longer stand living in limbo, wondering if his wife's late nights and cryptic messages with Mr. Thomas were innocent or something more. Emily had left for another late meeting with her boss. The house felt eerily quiet as John sat alone in the dimly lit living room, his thoughts racing. He knew he couldn't confront her just yet. He needed solid evidence. He needed to be absolutely sure. That's when he decided to take action. John's first move was to comb through the digital trail Emily might have left behind. He had already glimpsed her phone and found suspicious text messages with Mr. Thomas, but there could be more. John was no expert in hacking, but he knew his way around technology enough to check email logs, bank transactions, and social media activity. He opened her laptop, which Emily had carelessly left on the kitchen table. She often worked from home on the weekends, so her passwords were saved, giving him easy access. His fingers trembled slightly as he logged into her email account. If she had anything to hide, this was where it would be. John scrolled through the inbox. Most of it was work-related, innocuous emails from colleagues and clients. He almost sighed in relief. Maybe he had been wrong. But then he spotted a folder labeled Personal, tucked away in the corner of the screen. Clicking on it, his heart sank. Inside were several emails exchanged between Emily and Mr. Thomas, dated over the last few months. The subject lines were subtle, follow up on project or schedule for the week. But when he opened them, the content was far more intimate. The tone was friendly, overly familiar. Mr. Thomas referred to private dinners, thanking Emily for her company during work trips that John knew nothing about. One email in particular stood out. Last night was incredible. I can't wait to see you again. Let's meet this weekend, same place. There was no mention of a meeting or work, just a vague reference to something far more personal. John felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach, but it wasn't enough. These emails could still be brushed off as overly friendly, maybe even misinterpreted. He needed more. He had to be sure. John remembered that Emily had been working late at the office, often meeting Mr. Thomas at odd hours. But something about the pattern bothered him. It didn't add up. She never talked much about these meetings, and her explanations had become increasingly vague. He needed to see where she was really going. That's when he decided to use a GPS tracker. After doing some research, John purchased a small, discreet tracking device online. A couple of days later, it arrived, and he quickly attached it to Emily's car. She would never notice it, not tucked neatly under the rear bumper. Now, he would know exactly where she went during her late meetings. The next few days felt like an eternity. Every time Emily left the house, John checked the GPS tracker on his phone, watching the little that represented her car move across the map. She always left for work, but on several occasions, her car stopped at unfamiliar locations, places that weren't anywhere near the office. One evening, as Emily told him she'd be late again, John quietly tracked her car. He watched as the dot moved across town, not toward the office, but to a hotel on the other side of the city. His heart raced, hands shaking as he refreshed the screen, hoping it was a mistake. But no, the dot stayed there, parked for hours. Emily wasn't at work. She was with him. That night, when she returned home, John tried to act normal, but inside, he was boiling. Emily kissed him goodnight, saying she was exhausted, and went to bed. He stood in the living room, staring at the GPS tracker on his phone. Her lies were unraveling, and now he had something real to confront her with. But he wasn't ready yet. There was still more to uncover. The next morning, after Emily left for work, John made his next move. He called in sick and visited a private investigator he had found online. He was done playing detective by himself. If Emily and Mr. Thomas were sneaking around, he needed undeniable proof. Photos, logs, something he could present in black and white. The investigator, a sharp-looking man named Frank, listened to John's story without judgment. He nodded at the right moments and scribbled down notes, clearly having handled cases like this before. "We'll put a tail on her," Frank said calmly, as though this were a routine matter. "We'll track her movements, get you the evidence you need. If she's meeting someone, we'll know." John left the office feeling a grim sense of relief. It was only a matter of time now. The truth was closing in on Emily, and there would be no more room for lies. He would get his answers, whether he was ready for them or not. A week passed with John trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, though the tension in his chest grew heavier with each passing day. He hadn't yet confronted Emily, nor had he revealed the GPS tracker or his visit to the private investigator. The waiting gnawed at him, but he needed to be sure, completely sure, before he tore his life apart. The private investigator, Frank, had promised results soon. Every time John's phone buzzed, his heart jumped, wondering if it was Frank with the news that would shatter his world. When the call finally came late one afternoon, John's hands trembled as he picked up the phone. "John, it's Frank," came the calm voice on the other end. "We've got something. I think you'll want to see this." John felt a cold sweat break across his skin. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "What did you find?" Frank explained that he had tracked Emily for the past several days, tailing her as she left work late, claiming to be working on projects with Mr. Thomas. On multiple occasions, she had gone to the same hotel, each time meeting Mr. Thomas. There was no mistaking it now. Frank had taken photos, captured their meetings, and gathered more than enough evidence to confirm John's suspicions. "Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? I'll have everything prepared for you. Photos, reports, the works." John couldn't find his voice for a moment. The confirmation, though expected, hit him like a physical blow. "Yeah, I'll be there," he managed before hanging up. That night, as Emily sat across from him at dinner, laughing lightly about something a coworker had said, John felt like he was seeing her for the first time. She was the same Emily he had married, the same woman he had shared his life with for years, but now she was a stranger. She looked at him with affection, but it was all a lie, a mask hiding her betrayal. The next morning, John went to Frank's office and braced himself for what he was about to see. The investigator handed him a file folder, thick with photos and printed logs of Emily's movements. John opened it slowly, his eyes immediately drawn to the images. There, in crisp detail, was the proof he had dreaded. Emily entering a hotel room with Mr. Thomas. Another photo showed them sitting in a restaurant together, their hands brushing across the table. In the most damning photo, they stood in the dim glow of a parking lot, their faces close as they shared what appeared to be a kiss. John stared at the images, feeling the weight of his worst fears finally confirmed. There was no more room for doubt. "Do you want to know the full extent?" Frank asked, his voice steady but not unkind. "I can go over everything for you, but I think these photos speak for themselves." John shook his head, unable to speak. The evidence was clear, and it was enough. He thanked Frank numbly, gathered the folder, and left the office. The drive home was a blur. His mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. Should he confront Emily? Should he just leave, walk out, and never look back? The thought of her betrayal felt like a knife twisting in his chest. When John arrived home, Emily was still at work, giving him a moment to collect his thoughts. He poured himself a drink and sat in the living room, staring blankly at the walls. How could she have done this? Was it all for the promotion, as she had claimed? Or was there something deeper between her and Mr. Thomas? His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, rage, sadness, disbelief. But as the hours passed, a kind of numbness settled in. He knew he couldn't keep living this lie. He had to confront her. That evening, when Emily walked through the door, she was cheerful, as if nothing had happened. "Hey," she said, dropping her keys on the counter. "Work was exhausting today." John stood in the living room, the folder of evidence sitting on the coffee table in front of him. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew there was no turning back now. "Emily," he said, his voice steady though his insides were in turmoil. "We need to talk." She looked at him, sensing something was wrong. "What is it?" John didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the folder and handed it to her. Emily opened it, her eyes widening in shock as she flipped through the photos. Her face turned pale, her hands trembling as she reached the last one. "John, she began, but he cut her off. "Don't," he said quietly. "I know everything. I know about you and Mr. Thomas. I know about the late nights, the hotel rooms, all of it." Emily's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized there was nothing she could say to fix this. She had been caught, and the weight of her betrayal hung heavy in the air between them. John took a deep breath. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you do this?" Emily wiped at her eyes, struggling to find the words. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It started as just work, but then, he promised me the promotion. I thought it would help us. I thought it was for us, John." John stared at her, his heart breaking all over again. "For us," he repeated bitterly. "You did this for us?" He turned away, unable to look at her anymore. The truth had unfolded, and there was no going back. The weight of the silence between John and Emily was suffocating. The folder of damning evidence lay open on the coffee table, its contents scattered like the broken pieces of their marriage. Emily sat on the couch, her face pale and tear-streaked, staring blankly at the photos of her betrayal. John stood across the room, arms folded tightly across his chest, as though trying to physically hold himself together. Emily wiped at her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "John, please let me explain." John shook his head. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Explain," he echoed bitterly. "What is there to explain, Emily? I saw the photos. I read the messages. I know everything." She winced as his words hit her, but there was no escaping the truth anymore. "It was a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It was just work at first, just to get ahead, to secure the promotion for me and for you." John's eyes flashed with anger. "For me? You slept with him for me? Do you even hear yourself?" His voice rose, the raw emotion he had been holding back finally spilling over. "Do you have any idea how twisted that sounds?" Emily buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled by her palms. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought if I could get ahead, we could have the life we always wanted. The house, the vacations, the promotion for you. I was trying to secure our future." John stared at her, incredulous. "Our future? You thought this was securing our future?" He gestured to the photos, to the damning evidence of her affair. "This wasn't for us. This was for you. You thought sleeping with him would fix everything?" "I was trying to help," Emily cried, her voice breaking. "I didn't want you to lose your job, John. I didn't want us to struggle anymore." "We weren't struggling, Emily." John's voice cracked, the hurt pouring through him. "We were fine. We were happy. I thought we were happy. But you couldn't leave well enough alone, could you? You had to chase after something more, something that destroyed everything we had." Emily sobbed, her face buried in her hands, and John felt his anger begin to boil over. The betrayal, the lies, the nights he had spent alone wondering where she was, it all came crashing down on him. He had trusted her. He had believed in their marriage, in the vows they had made to each other. And she had shattered it all for what? A promotion? John turned away from her, unable to look at her anymore. The sight of her broke his heart all over again. He felt like a fool, like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about his marriage, was a lie. "I didn't want to hurt you," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. John laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Well, congratulations. You did." He sank onto the chair across from her, rubbing his hands over his face. He was exhausted, drained of every ounce of energy he had. How had it come to this? How had they gone from being the perfect couple, the one everyone envied, to this moment of complete destruction? Emily looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Please, John, I'll do anything. I'll quit my job. I'll cut all ties with Mr. Thomas. I just don't want to lose you." John's heart ached as he heard the desperation in her voice, but he knew there was no going back from this. "How long?" he asked quietly, his voice strained. "How long has this been going on?" Emily hesitated, biting her lip. "A few months," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "It started during that conference last year. I thought it would be just a one-time thing, but it got complicated." John's stomach churned. "So this has been going on for months?" he repeated, his voice hollow. "All those nights you said you were working late, all the times I waited up for you. You were with him?" Emily nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I'm so sorry, John. I was so stupid. I didn't know how to stop." John's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles white. "You didn't know how to stop?" he repeated, incredulous. "How about not starting in the first place? How about thinking about me, about us, before you decided to throw yourself at your boss?" "I was scared," Emily cried. "I was scared of losing everything. Mr. Thomas, he said he could help us, help you get ahead too." John laughed again, that same bitter, broken sound. "Help me? You think Mr. Thomas was going to help me? He wasn't helping me, Emily. He was using you." Emily sobbed harder, and John could barely look at her. His heart was breaking into a million pieces, but there was nothing left to salvage. The betrayal was too deep, too painful. After a long silence, Emily spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Is there any chance we can fix this?" John looked at her, his eyes filled with hurt and betrayal. "How do you expect me to fix this?" he asked quietly. "How do you expect me to forget what you've done?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't know how to. She had destroyed their marriage, and now she was standing in the ruins, hoping for a miracle. John stood up, his legs shaky. "I need to go," he said, grabbing his coat. "I can't be here right now." Emily stood up quickly, her voice panicked. "John, please, don't leave. We can talk about this. We can figure something out." He shook his head, his face hardening. "No, Emily. I need space. I need time to think." His voice cracked again. "You've broken everything, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Emily reached out to him, but John pulled away. "Please, John, don't go." But he was already walking to the door. The love he had once felt for her, the trust that had been the foundation of their marriage, was shattered. He didn't know if he would ever find a way to rebuild it. As John closed the door behind him, Emily collapsed onto the couch, her sobs echoing through the empty house. John walked out into the cold night, feeling as though a part of him had died inside. There was no easy fix for this, no way to mend what had been broken, and he wasn't sure if he even wanted to try. The days following the confrontation were a blur for John. He moved into a hotel temporarily, unable to bear the thought of being in the same house with Emily. He avoided her calls and texts, each one more desperate than the last. Every time his phone buzzed, he felt a mix of anger and sadness, but he wasn't ready to hear more excuses or apologies. Then, one afternoon, after nearly a week of silence, John's phone rang again. He sighed when he saw Emily's name, fully intending to let it go to voicemail as usual. But something inside him told him to pick up, a nagging feeling that this call might be different. "John," Emily's voice was shaky on the other end, but it wasn't desperation he heard this time. It was fear. "I need to talk to you. It's important." "I've heard enough, Emily," John replied coldly. "There's nothing more to say." "No, John. Please, just listen." Her voice cracked, and the fear became palpable. "I'm pregnant." John froze, the world around him coming to a standstill. His mind struggled to process the words. Pregnant. Emily was pregnant. He swallowed hard. The anger he had been holding onto suddenly mixed with confusion. "Pregnant?" he repeated slowly, as though the word might change if he said it again. "What do you mean, pregnant?" Emily took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "I just found out. I'm about 8 weeks along." John's chest tightened. 8 weeks. That would place the conception right in the middle of the affair. His mind raced, and a sickening realization began to dawn on him. "Is it mine?" The words came out sharper than he intended, but he needed to know. Emily hesitated. I don't know, John. I'm not sure." Those words hit John like a punch to the gut. He staggered to the nearest chair, sitting down as the enormity of the situation sank in. She didn't know. The child could be his, or it could be Mr. Thomas's. "You don't know?" he echoed, his voice thick with disbelief. "How could you not know?" Emily was sobbing on the other end now. "I'm so sorry, John. I didn't expect this to happen. I don't know what to do." John clenched his fists, anger and grief swirling inside him. How had it come to this? Just weeks ago, he had thought they were a happy couple. Now, he was facing the possibility of raising another man's child, the child of the man who had destroyed his marriage. "Have you told him?" John asked, his voice hardening. "Does Thomas know?" "No," Emily replied quickly. "I haven't told him. I wanted to talk to you first. John, I don't want to lose you. I don't want him to be part of this. I want us to figure this out." John couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You want me to figure this out?" he spat, his voice shaking. "You had an affair with your boss, and now you're pregnant, and you want me to figure it out?" Emily's sobs grew louder, but John couldn't find any sympathy left. His heart was torn apart, and he didn't know what to think, let alone how to fix it. "I'll get a paternity test," Emily said, her voice trembling. "We can find out for sure. I just wanted you to know before I did anything." John closed his eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a boulder. A part of him wanted to hang up and never speak to her again. Another part, the part still clinging to the life they had built together, wanted answers. "Get the test," John said quietly. "And then we'll talk." He hung up before she could respond, dropping the phone onto the table and running his hands through his hair. Pregnant. He never thought his life could unravel like this, but now he was staring at the possibility that the woman he had loved might be carrying another man's child. John sat in the silent room, his mind spinning. What was he going to do if the baby wasn't his? Could he really walk away from everything they had built, knowing a child was involved? Or would he be forced to raise the child of the man who had ruined his marriage? It was a dark twist he had never seen coming, and now he had no idea how to escape it. All he could do was wait for the truth. John paced back and forth in the office parking lot, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent the last few days reeling from the news of Emily's pregnancy, his emotions in constant turmoil. The wait for the paternity test was unbearable, and each passing moment only heightened his anger and frustration. There was one person he hadn't confronted yet, and John knew he couldn't move forward until he did. He had to face Mr. Thomas. Today, John wasn't going to be the quiet, controlled man he had tried to be. Today, he was ready for a fight. Mr. Thomas had not only lived with his wife, but had also jeopardized the life John had built with Emily. Now, there was a possibility that the baby Emily carried wasn't even his. The thought of raising another man's child, his boss's child, was something he couldn't live with. Taking a deep breath, John marched toward Mr. Thomas's office, his fists clenched. As he approached the door, he didn't bother knocking. He pushed it open with a force that startled the older man sitting behind his desk. Mr. Thomas looked up, surprised. "John? What are you?" "Cut the crap," John snapped, stepping inside and slamming the door shut behind him. His voice was low and filled with barely restrained fury. "You know exactly why I'm here." Mr. Thomas's expression shifted from surprise to discomfort. He leaned back in his chair, attempting to maintain his composure, but the tension in the room was palpable. "This is about Emily," Mr. Thomas said, his tone cautious. "Of course it's about Emily," John spat. He took a step closer, his eyes blazing with anger. "You think I wouldn't find out? You think you could sleep with my wife, ruin my marriage, and just walk away like nothing happened?" Mr. Thomas held up his hands in a gesture of defense. "John, listen, I never intended for things to get out of hand. It wasn't supposed to be." "Save it," John interrupted, his voice trembling with rage. "She's pregnant, Thomas. Do you understand that? Pregnant. And she doesn't even know if the baby is mine or yours." The color drained from Mr. Thomas's face. For the first time, he looked genuinely shaken. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the weight of John's words sinking in. "I didn't know," Mr. Thomas said quietly. "I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," John snarled, "because you didn't care. All you cared about was using her. You promised her promotions, dangled her career in front of her like a carrot while you slept with her behind my back." Mr. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but John cut him off again, stepping closer until he was standing right in front of the desk, glaring down at him. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed my life, my marriage, and now you might have a child with my wife." Mr. Thomas's hands tightened around the arms of his chair. "I'm sorry, John. Truly, I am. But I can't change what's happened." John leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "Sorry isn't going to fix this. If that baby turns out to be yours, I swear you'll regret ever stepping into our lives." Mr. Thomas looked down, guilt and shame etched on his face. But John didn't care about his remorse. The damage was done, and no apology could undo the betrayal. Without another word, John turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mr. Thomas to sit in his regret. As John stepped outside into the cold air, he took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. The confrontation had ended, but the battle was far from over. Now, he had to wait for the paternity test, for the final truth that would determine the rest of his life. The days after John's confrontation with Mr. Thomas were some of the darkest of his life. He had returned to the hotel, where the loneliness felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emily, saw the pictures from the investigator, and heard her tearful confession playing on a loop in his mind. He had spent hours staring at his phone, waiting for the paternity test results. His life had been put on pause, every decision hinging on whether the child Emily carried was his or Mr. Thomas's. The weight of that uncertainty was crushing him. The message finally came late one afternoon. He was sitting at a coffee shop, staring blankly at his untouched drink when his phone buzzed. His hands shook as he opened the email from the clinic. The baby wasn't his. John's chest tightened as he read the words over and over, hoping somehow they would change. But the results were clear. The child Emily was carrying was not his. It was Mr. Thomas's. A strange mixture of relief and devastation washed over him. He had feared this outcome, but part of him had also clung to the hope that the baby was his, that somehow they could rebuild their life from the wreckage. But now, there was no chance of that. The truth was undeniable, and it hit him like a sledgehammer. His marriage was over. John sat there for a long time, the world around him fading into the background. Everything felt surreal, as though he were floating outside his own body. The decision that had been looming over him for weeks now seemed clear, unavoidable. He couldn't stay in this marriage. He couldn't live a life haunted by this betrayal, by the knowledge that his wife had not only cheated on him but was now carrying the child of another man, his boss. Later that evening, John drove back to the house for what he knew would be the last time. He hadn't spoken to Emily since she told him she was pregnant, and he wasn't sure how she would react when he walked through the door. As he entered, the familiar scent of home washed over him, but it no longer felt like his. The warmth, the memories, they all seemed distant now, like a dream that had slipped away. Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and drawn. She looked up when he entered, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "John," she whispered, standing up slowly, "did you get the results?" John nodded, his expression unreadable. "I got them." Emily took a shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "And it's not mine," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. Emily's face crumpled, and she sank back into the chair, tears spilling down her cheeks. "John, I'm so sorry. I never wanted this. I never meant to hurt you." John stayed silent for a long moment, his eyes focused on the floor. Finally, he looked up, his gaze steady. "I'm leaving, Emily." Emily's sobs grew louder, but John continued, his voice calm, resigned. "This marriage is over. I can't be with you anymore. Not after everything. Not after him. And now with the baby. I can't do it." Emily shook her head, her words spilling out in a desperate rush. "John, please. We can fix this. I'll do anything. We can go to therapy. We can start over. I don't care about the promotion, about Thomas. I only want you. I love you." John's chest tightened at her words, but he knew it was too late. The betrayal had cut too deep, and no amount of apologies or promises could repair the damage. He had given her everything, his love, his trust, and she had shattered it. "I loved you too," John said quietly. "But you destroyed that, Emily. You destroyed us." She stood up, reaching for him, her hands trembling. "Please, John, I'll raise the baby alone. I won't ask you for anything. Just don't leave me." John stepped back, his heart breaking all over again. "I can't stay here, Emily. I can't be a part of this." Emily sobbed harder, collapsing into the chair again. "What am I supposed to do without you?" she whispered through her tears. John swallowed hard, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "You'll figure it out," he said softly. "You'll be fine." He turned away, heading toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he paused for a moment, taking in the house one last time. The place where they had built a life together, where they had shared so many moments of happiness. Now, it was just a shell of what it had once been. Without another word, John walked out, the door closing softly behind him. He felt a deep, aching emptiness inside, but he also knew that this was the only way forward. He couldn't stay in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. He couldn't raise another man's child, especially not the child of the man who had destroyed his marriage. As he drove away from the house for the last time, John felt a mixture of grief and relief. The chapter of his life with Emily had come to a bitter end, but at least now, he knew the truth. Now, he could begin the long, painful process of moving on. 6 months had passed since John had walked out of the home he had once shared with Emily. The pain of those final days still lingered, but time had dulled the sharp edges of his grief. The divorce was finalized, and with it came a sense of closure, though the scars of betrayal remained. John had moved into a small apartment across town, a far cry from the house he had once envisioned raising a family in. It was modest, but it was his, a fresh start, a place where he could begin to rebuild his life. The boxes were mostly unpacked now, the furniture arranged just so, but the space still felt empty, quiet, sometimes too quiet. He stood on his balcony one evening, watching as the sun set over the city skyline. The air was warm, and the soft breeze carried with it the distant sounds of life moving on around him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a small sense of peace. In the months that followed the divorce, John had thrown himself into work, keeping his mind occupied with projects and late nights at the office. It had been easier than confronting the feelings of loss and betrayal head-on. He had cut ties with Mr. Thomas, leaving the company not long after the divorce was finalized. Working under the man who had destroyed his marriage had been unbearable, and leaving was the only option. He had taken a new job at a smaller firm, where the pressure was less intense, the hours more manageable. His colleagues were supportive, though he kept his personal life private, not wanting to relive the pain of the past. But the distance had helped, and the change in environment allowed him to slowly begin the process of healing. Emily had reached out a few times after the divorce, wanting to talk, to apologize again. But John had made it clear there was no point in reopening old wounds. He couldn't go back, and neither could she. The last he heard, she had given birth to the baby, a boy. The news stirred complicated emotions in John, but ultimately, it solidified his decision. That chapter of his life was over. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, John sipped his drink, reflecting on how much had changed. The hurt was still there, but it no longer consumed him. He was learning to live with it, to accept that sometimes life doesn't turn out the way you expect. People you trust can betray you, love can falter, and dreams can be shattered. But life went on, and so did he. For the first time in months, John allowed himself to think about the future, about the possibility of finding happiness again. He wasn't sure what that looked like yet, but he knew he was ready to move forward. Slowly, cautiously, but with the knowledge that he deserved better than the life he had left behind. As the last light of the day faded into the horizon, John stood on his balcony, breathing in the cool evening air. The world felt wide open again, full of new possibilities. He wasn't the same man who had walked away from his broken marriage, but he was still standing, and now he was ready to move on.